I'm going to talk tonight about the time that I represented Huey Newton, who many of you will recognize as one of the founders of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. This year is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party. I'm sorry to say I'm going to use notes. I won't be as funny as Scott. I won't be as effective as Ms. Chatterjee. But I'm going to tell you some stories. Some of you, there may be a couple of people in the room who don't know about the Black Panthers. In the 1960 Olympics, there were a couple of runners named Tommy Smith and John Carlos. They won and came third place the 200-meter race. And at the time they were presented with their medals, they raised their fist in a Black Power salute. And they were cut off from the Olympics. They had their medals taken away, all sorts of things done to them. Recently, the Passionate Eye on the CBC ran a 2-hour documentary on the Panthers called The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. It was made in 2015. And some of you may recall that at the Super Bowl this year, the halftime show was done by Beyonce, and it was a tribute to the Black Panther Party. The women who were dancing wore the berets from the Black Panthers. They wore a similar outfit. They raised their fist in the Black Power salute. So that's a little bit of a background about the Panthers. Recently, there's a quarterback for San Francisco named Colin Kaepernick, who, rather than stand for the national anthem, kneeled for the national anthem, and that's produced another controversy in the United States. And as many of you will know, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and in Canada is very concerned, particularly about policing and the killing of blacks. The Panthers, one of the things that they did, and they were all over the United States after a while, they ran a very effective breakfast program for youth in Oakland originally. And if you watch the documentary, certainly see pictures of that. Huey Newton himself was somebody who had been in trouble occasionally with the law, not very often in serious cases, but he was at one point charged with murder of a police officer. That got resolved in a fairly mild-mannered manner for him. In August 1974 in Oakland, a 15-year-old young woman was murdered, and Huey was charged with killing her. He was released on bail, and for reasons that I still don't understand, jumped bail and went to Cuba. And he had some nice stories to tell me when I met him about how the Cubans sort of didn't welcome him in Cuba. They knew he was coming. Anyway, I don't have time to cover that. After a few years in Cuba, he decided he wanted to come back to the United States and face the murder trial and get back on with his life. And he approached, as I understand it, he approached the Canadian government officials in Cuba to see whether he could be admitted to Canada on his way back to the United States, because there were no direct flights. In fact, until very recently, there have been no direct flights from the United States to Cuba. And originally, the Canadians told him he could come through Canada, and then they checked a little more on his background. They said, no, he couldn't come through Canada. And a guy named Michael Burns approached me in Toronto. I didn't know Michael, and I'm not quite sure how he got to me as a possible person to represent Huey. Michael had worked in Hollywood for quite a while and knew some of the people there. I had done some work with the Panthers earlier on, once helping them to smuggle a French author into New Haven, Connecticut to speak on behalf of Bobby Seale. So I had a little bit of history with them. And what I said when I spoke to Huey, or maybe I spoke to Michael, I said, tell him to get on a plane and come here and we'll sort it out. Tell him to come to Toronto. So in June of 1977, I went to the airport to assist Huey on his entry. He flew in from Cuba with a lawyer named Fred Heestand, who was the Panther lawyer in Oakland, California. And Fred had an interesting background. He was not only the counsel to the Black Panther Party, and he was a white guy, he was also counsel to Governor Jerry Brown on medical negligence issues. And as Fred told me the story, he went to Governor Brown one day and said, look, I've been retained to represent Huey, to help him come from Cuba to Canada to the United States. And Governor Brown said to him, well, you know, that's fine. That's not a problem, but I don't think you can be my counsel anymore in the medical negligence issues. And Fred said, that's fine. The next morning, he gets a call from Governor Brown, says, why aren't you at the meeting about medical negligence? And Fred says, well, actually, you told me I'm not your counsel anymore. And Governor Brown said, well, you know, you're not my counsel. You're now counsel to the Legislative Assembly, and get down to the meeting. So that was, Fred was fairly close to Governor Brown, and I talked to him fairly recently, and he's still close to Governor Brown, who's back in office. Anyway, on the day in June of '77, about 6 o'clock in the evening, I called immigration at the airport and told them I was representing Huey Newton. I was going to come out to the airport, and I wanted to talk to Huey after he got off the plane and before he was interrogated by immigration. About 9 o'clock, I went out to the airport and phoned immigration and said I was at Terminal 2. Told them I wanted to talk to Huey when he arrived. I was told I could not see him until, if I can read my notes here, well, I could not see him until immigration had finished with him. I called several times, about 20 minutes each time, and each time that I called, spoke to the same immigration officer. She was quite unpleasant. She suggested I was out there drumming up business. It was a really strange process. And after many calls, I was told that the immigration examination of Huey was finished, and he was sent to the jail in Brampton, and I could see him there. I had told her of his right and every person's right. Many of you will be familiar with the Charter of Rights. I don't know how many people you are familiar with Diefenbaker's Canadian Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights had a provision in it that said if you're detained, you have the right to instruct counsel, or retain and instruct counsel. And I told her about that. And I went out, and I'll tell you a bit about what happened with Huey after that, but one of the things that I did, I was so pissed off with this woman that I went before a justice of the peace and laid a criminal charge against her under what was then Section 115 of the Criminal Code, which was a provision that said, if you violate a law of Canada for which there's no penalty provided, you're guilty of an offense under this section. So she was charged with denying him the right to counsel under the Canadian Charter of Rights, or Canadian Bill of Rights. That charge, I dealt with the prosecutor on the charge quite a bit, but it's a little hard to prove the charge because Huey was in Oakland, California at the time that the charges came up in the Canadian court. Anyway, after that happened, I represented Huey at a special inquiry. We started the inquiry I think actually the next day after he arrived. And the government didn't have all their paperwork together to prove that he was inadmissible. Back then, the admissibility provisions were that you had to have been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude. And the crimes Huey had been convicted of had gotten watered down in the process, and they didn't have the paperwork to establish it. Managed to persuade the immigration officer to set bail for Huey, and the bail was set at $1,000 to be signed by a prominent Canadian, whatever the hell that meant. And so I started looking around for a prominent Canadian. The first person I tried to reach was Tommy Douglas, the leader of the NDP, because Tommy's daughter, Shirley Douglas, had been active with the Panthers in California. And for some of you who don't know her, she's married to Donald Sutherland, is the mother of Kiefer Sutherland. Anyway, I couldn't find Tommy. I then tried Stephen Lewis, who was at that point the leader of the NDP in the Ontario legislature. I knew Stephen fairly well, but I couldn't find him either. I then moved on to Jim Renwick, who's the deputy leader of the NDP in the Ontario legislature. I knew Jim fairly well. I'd actually worked on his leadership campaign about 7 years earlier. Jim was quite a straight guy. He was a former corporate lawyer at a firm called Borden and Elliott. And I said, Jim, I called him up. I said, Jim, do you want to find out if you're a prominent Canadian? and explained the situation to him, and he said, sure. So I then phoned immigration and speak to an immigration officer who's going to be the one who accepts the surety or doesn't accept the surety. And I said, do you regard Jim Renwick as a prominent Canadian? And he said, yeah. What I didn't know then, and I didn't know because it hadn't happened, that person was Michael Prue, who was later the mayor of East York and then a member of the NDP in the Ontario legislature. So I managed to luck out by getting a progressive immigration officer. Anyway, so Huey gets out, and one of the first things we do is a press conference out at a hotel near the airport. And one of the reporters there says to Huey, how come Jim Renwick signed your bail? And Huey politely and quietly says, well, he's a revolutionary like I am. Anyway, what happened after that was that we got permission from immigration for Huey to get on an airplane. He flew to Vancouver and then flew back to Oakland to face the murder charge. So the immigration agreed that that wouldn't violate his bond. He went back. He actually made bail in Oakland, I'm sorry. And they did the trial twice. They had hung juries 2 times, and then the prosecutor gave up on the prosecution, and Huey was a free man. A couple of years later, I went on a trip down to San Francisco. I was supposed to go with a friend who couldn't go with me, so I was down there by myself. Sorry. And so I called up Fred Heastand, the lawyer who I dealt with, and we went out and watched a movie together. And Fred said to me, well, are you going to call Huey? And I hadn't thought of calling Huey at all. I mean, I knew him from a couple of days in Canada. He said, you should call Huey. So I call Huey. I'm staying in a grungy little hotel in San Francisco. Huey comes to pick me up with his wife, Gwen, in their Mercedes. We go to the Bank of America building, the 54th floor, where there's a beautiful lounge and restaurant. And we sit in the lounge. We're overlooking the San Francisco Bay and Alcatraz prison. And we're sitting around and we're talking about what Huey's been up to. And he was working on his PhD. He was trying to write his PhD on what the FBI had been doing to the Black Panther Party. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had run something called COINTELPRO, which is a counterintelligence program where they basically sought to disrupt whoever they didn't like, and there's a million stories. They targeted Martin Luther King. They called his wife Coretta and told her that Martin had affairs all over the place. Anything they could do to screw up a person's life. So Huey, being interested in what they had on the Panthers, had applied under the Freedom of Information Act to see what they had. He got 2 million pages of FBI material on the Black Panther Party. One of the stories he told me was that they had always joked in the Panthers that the FBI had a microphone on every bed. When they got the 2 million pages, frequently there were references to sounds of sexual activity. The other one last little piece that I'd like to tell you about Huey was we were sitting and talking when he was in Canada, and we were talking about the Cuban justice system. And Huey had been in Cuba for a couple of years. And one of the things he said was, every criminal act in Cuba is regarded as a counter-revolutionary act, and your lawyer there will always be denouncing the counter-revolutionary act while trying to defend you. And what he said, which struck me with some significance, was, just between you and I, I'd rather be tried in an American court. Thank you.